Charles wants a new-look monarchy and a shorter, smaller, less expensive coronation ceremony next year.
The night the British monarchy changed forever did not begin with a declaration. It did not begin with a press release, a carefully worded royal statement, or a solemn address from behind palace walls. It began with a crown. A single, gleaming, impossibly heavy crown, lifted from a ceremonial cushion in front of millions of watching eyes, and carried deliberately, purposefully, and without a single word of warning, away from the woman who expected it, and placed upon the head of the woman who would define the future. No one in that banquet hall saw it coming. Not the dignitaries seated in their gilded chairs. Not the camera operators tracking every movement with practiced precision. Not the journalists positioned along the edges of the room, their fingers already hovering over their keyboards, waiting for the evening's predictable formalities to produce their predictable headlines. And certainly not Camilla. The night had begun the way these evenings always do. Grand, ceremonial, controlled. The kind of event the British monarchy has spent centuries perfecting, every detail rehearsed, every position assigned, every movement choreographed to project an image of seamless, unshakable unity to a watching world. Buckingham Palace's grand banquet hall glittered under the weight of its own magnificence. Crystal chandeliers threw cascading light across the room. Uniformed staff moved between tables with silent efficiency. Cameras from 17 international broadcasters were positioned to capture every moment of what had been billed as one of the most significant royal state events of the decade. And then King Charles walked in. The room rose, the way it always does. The instinctive, collective acknowledgement of a man who carries the full weight of an ancient institution on his shoulders every time he enters a room. His posture was steady, his expression unreadable. Those who had watched him for decades, who had studied the precise language of his face through triumphs and tragedies and everything in between, noticed something that night that they struggled afterward to name. Not tension exactly, not grief, something quieter and more dangerous than either. Resolve. Camilla stood in her designated position, composed and elegant in a deep sapphire gown, every inch the queen consort she had spent decades fighting to become. She had earned this. Every person in that room understood that, and she understood it most of all. The years of public judgment, of whispered disapproval, of a nation that had loved someone else and made no secret of it. She had endured all of it with a patience that bordered on extraordinary. And here she was, still standing, still present, still the woman beside the king. The ceremonial crown rested on its cushion, held by a palace official at the front of the room. A masterpiece of gold and precious stones. It caught the light the way only things of immense and deliberate beauty can, scattering brilliance in every direction. It was more than jewelry. It had always been more than jewelry. It was a message. A symbol, a declaration made in diamonds and history that said, without words, this woman belongs here. And then something happened that nobody in that room, nobody watching from 17 different countries, nobody in the long and complicated history of the British royal family had ever seen before. Charles reached for the crown. Hi viewers, here is a question only you can answer. If you were in that room watching this happen live, would you have felt that Charles did the right thing or gone too far? The cushion bearer stepped forward as trained. The moment was supposed to be straightforward. Procedural. Another beat in a long evening of carefully orchestrated ceremony. But Charles did not follow the script. He lifted the crown himself, both hands, deliberate and unhurried, and he turned. Not toward Camilla, away from her. And he began to walk. The room felt it before anyone could process it. That particular silence that falls when something unprecedented is happening and the human mind, still catching up, does not yet have the language to describe what the eyes are already seeing. A few guests exchanged glances. A camera operator shifted angle. One journalist later described it as the moment the air changed, as though the temperature in the room dropped several degrees in the space of a single breath. Camilla did not move. She stood exactly where she had been standing, and for a fraction of a second, the faintest trace of confusion crossed her face. Just a flicker. Gone almost as quickly as it arrived, replaced immediately by that practiced composure she had spent years perfecting. But the cameras were rolling, and cameras, unlike people, do not look away out of politeness. Charles walked past her, not around her, past her, close enough that the silk of his ceremonial robes stirred the air between them. He did not slow. He did not glance in her direction. He did not offer the smallest acknowledgement that she was standing there at all. And in that absence, in that deliberate, devastating silence, he said everything he had chosen not to say out loud. Catherine was standing several feet away. She had known. Of course she had known. She had been briefed in the quiet days before the banquet, in a conversation that was brief and direct and carried the full gravity of what was being asked of her. She wore a composed expression that was not quite calm and not quite nervous, but existed in the particular space between the two that belongs to people who have accepted a weight they did not ask for and have decided to carry it with dignity anyway. When Charles stopped before her, the room stopped with him. She inclined her head. A small, graceful movement. Not performance. Not theater. Simply the gesture of someone who understands the magnitude of what is happening and is choosing to meet it with stillness rather than spectacle. And then, in front of the cameras and the dignitaries and the journalists and the 17 international broadcasters and the millions watching at home, King Charles placed the crown upon the head of Catherine, Princess of Wales. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which the entire weight of what had just happened settled over the room like something physical. And then the world erupted. To understand what happened in that banquet hall, you have to go back. Not just days. Not just months. You have to go back to the slow, quiet accumulation of decisions that nobody flagged, conversations that nobody formally recorded, and a plan that was never meant to be found. King Charles III is not a man who acts without reason. That is the first thing every serious royal observer will tell you. He is methodical, measured, a man shaped by decades of preparation for a role he understood, better than anyone, carried consequences that outlasted any single moment. He had waited longer than any heir in British history for the crown. And when it finally came to him, he wore it with the particular gravity of someone who had long since made peace with what it cost. That is what makes what happened at the banquet so impossible to dismiss. Because Charles does not do impulsive. Charles does not do theatrical. Every significant decision of his reign has been deliberate, considered, and executed with the kind of precision that leaves nothing to chance. So when a man like that walks past his wife in front of the world without a single glance, you are not watching a moment of emotion. You are watching the conclusion of a process. A long, painful, carefully considered process that began not with the banquet, but with a folder. A dark blue folder. It arrived on his desk 10 days before the state event. Placed there by one of his most senior private secretaries with no accompanying explanation beyond a quiet suggestion that the king read it before the day's formal briefings began. Unremarkable in appearance. Standard issue. The kind of folder that moves through palace offices dozens of times a day carrying routine correspondence, diplomatic summaries, charity reports. But this one was different. Charles picked it up on a Tuesday morning in his private study, a room that smelled of old leather and wood smoke and the particular weight of accumulated history. He settled into his chair. He opened the folder, and at first nothing alarmed him. The early pages were administrative, a summary of scheduling proposals, a list of names attached to upcoming national events and overseas engagements. He scanned them with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to processing large volumes of palace paperwork before breakfast. And then he saw the name. Laura Lopez, Camilla's daughter from her first marriage. A woman Charles had always treated with warmth. A woman he had welcomed into the extended family without hesitation or condition, because she was part of Camilla, and Camilla was everything. He had never questioned Laura's presence at family gatherings, never found her proximity to palace life anything other than natural. She was a daughter, a mother's child. That had always been enough. But Laura's name was not appearing on a guest list. It was appearing on personnel proposals, on role descriptions, on scheduling frameworks for future national tours and overseas engagements that were, without exception, reserved exclusively for senior working members of the royal family. People who carried titles. People who sat within the recognized succession. People whose public roles had been formally approved through channels that existed precisely because the monarchy is not a private family business. It is a constitutional institution. Charles set the folder down. He picked it up again. He read the same pages twice, then a third time, because the mind, when confronted with something it does not want to accept, has a habit of searching for the alternative explanation. The innocent reading, the reasonable justification. He looked for one. He did not find it. Something had been built without his knowledge. Something deliberate. Something structured. And it had been building for longer than he had realized. Here is what nobody outside a small circle of palace insiders knew at the time. The investigation that followed was conducted with the kind of quiet urgency that leaves no visible trace. A trusted group of palace legal advisors and senior private secretaries, people with decades of royal service and the particular loyalty that only comes from that depth of tenure, were asked to look closer. They worked in a room in the palace's east wing, surrounded by archival documents that had barely been disturbed in years, their movements unhurried and deliberate, their findings assembled piece by careful piece over the course of 4 days. What they found was not a rumor, not an exaggeration. It was a plan, a carefully constructed, meticulously documented, deliberately concealed plan to introduce Laura Lopez into an official capacity within the working structure of the monarchy. Not as a family companion, not as a casual guest at public events, but as a formal representative of the Queen, accompanying Camilla on national and international engagements in a role that carried all the weight and visibility of senior royal duty without any of the formal processes that were supposed to govern such appointments. Think about that for a moment. Those processes exist for a reason. Parliamentary awareness, public transparency, constitutional accountability. They are not bureaucratic formalities. They are the architecture that separates a modern constitutional monarchy from something far older and far less accountable. To move someone into that space without acknowledgement, without approval, without any of the mechanisms designed to make such decisions answerable to the public, that is not a family matter. That is something else entirely. But it was not the plan itself that hit Charles the hardest. It was a single detail buried in the final pages of the investigation report. A detail so precise, so specific, and so impossible to explain away that when Charles read it, the room seemed to contract around him. The advisors who had been recruited into this quiet network, the officials who had attended the unrecorded meetings and received the sealed correspondence bearing Camilla's private crest, had been told that the plan reflected the king's own wishes, that Charles himself had endorsed it, that this was part of his forward-thinking vision for a modernized, more inclusive royal family. His name, his authority, used to give momentum to a plan he had never seen, never discussed, and never sanctioned. Charles stood up from his chair. He walked to the window. He stood there for a long time, watching the guards below complete their ancient, rhythmic rotation in the courtyard, that unbroken ceremonial continuity that has endured through every crisis the institution has ever weathered. Everything out there looked exactly as it should. But inside this room, inside this man, something had fractured along a line he had not known was there. He had trusted her completely, and that trust had been used. The meeting that followed was not planned for maximum drama. Nothing about King Charles III ever is. It was arranged quietly, through a single private secretary, for a Wednesday afternoon in one of the palace's smaller receiving rooms. A round table, 2 chairs. The particular kind of intimacy that only makes the distance between people feel more vast. Charles arrived first. He sat down. He placed the green-covered file on the table in front of him and rested one hand on top of it, lightly, without pressure, the way you might rest your hand on something you are not yet ready to open. He waited. Camilla entered the room the way she always does, with composure, with that particular quality of self-possession that had carried her through decades of public scrutiny and private storm. She wore a cream blouse and a single strand of pearls, the same pearls she had worn on dozens of occasions when she needed something familiar to anchor her. She sat down across from him. She looked at the file. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke immediately. That silence was its own conversation. When Charles finally opened his mouth, his voice was low, controlled. And beneath the control, something was audible that those who know him well have rarely heard. Not anger. Anger would have been easier. This was grief. The particular, quiet devastation of a man who loved someone deeply and had just been handed proof that the love had been handled carelessly with his name. He spoke without accusation, without theater. He talked about limits, about responsibilities, about the ancient, fragile, extraordinary institution that neither of them had built but both of them had sworn to protect. He spoke about what happens when private ambition, however tenderly motivated, begins to move through the channels of public trust without permission. His fingers tapped the table as he spoke, softly, slowly, each tap like a quiet metronome marking time against the silence. Camilla listened. She held herself with remarkable steadiness through the early part of the conversation. But when Charles turned to a specific page, the one outlining the proposal for Laura in an official touring capacity, something shifted in her. Her hands, resting on the table, closed into themselves. Her jaw set. Her gaze moved briefly to the wall behind him, to a framed photograph hanging there, one of those informal family images that find their way into private palace rooms, a captured moment from years past where Laura and her brother could be seen at the edges of a gathering, present but not quite centered, belonging but not quite claimed. And in that moment, without a single word being exchanged, you could see everything. You could see the mother beneath the queen. She had not been trying to destabilize an institution. She had not been operating from ambition or arrogance or any of the motivations that make for simple, comfortable villains. She had been watching her daughter spend years on the periphery of a world that had consumed her mother entirely, and she had done what mothers do. She had tried to close the gap, quietly, carefully, with all the resources available to her. But the resources available to a queen consort include things that are not hers alone to use. And that was the line she had crossed. Charles delivered his position without ambiguity. Complete acknowledgement of what had been done. An immediate and permanent end to every effort to bring Laura into any official palace role. No negotiation. No phased withdrawal. No compromise dressed up as compromise. Camilla stood slowly. She said nothing. The way she gathered herself and turned toward the door said more than any response could have. It was not defeat exactly. It was the movement of someone who had always known, somewhere beneath everything, that this moment was coming. That the thing she had been quietly building could not survive exposure. And that the man sitting at that table, for all his patience and all his love, was first and always a king. The banquet was 4 days away. 4 days between that shattered private silence and the most watched royal event of the year. And Charles had already decided that a private confrontation was not enough. That a quiet internal resolution, handled behind closed doors and buried in palace files, would not carry the weight of what needed to be communicated. Not just to Camilla, not just to the advisors who had participated in her network, but to the institution itself, to the future. He needed to make a statement, not with words, with the most powerful language a monarch has ever possessed. He needed to use a symbol. The night of the state banquet arrived cold and clear, the kind of London evening where the sky above the palace carries a particular sharpness, as if the city itself is paying attention. Inside the grand ballroom, the preparations had been underway since early morning. Tables set with the precision of military operation. Floral arrangements assembled by the same team that had served the palace for 30 years. The kind of institutional muscle memory that makes these events appear effortless to the outside world, concealing the extraordinary machinery required to produce them. The guests arrived in waves. Dignitaries and ambassadors, senior government figures, representatives of the organizations the crown had championed across decades of public service. They took their seats with the particular mixture of genuine ceremony and careful social performance that these occasions always produce. Cameras were positioned. Sound levels were checked. 17 international broadcasting teams settled into their designated spaces. Their lenses pointed toward the front of the room where the ceremonial portion of the evening would unfold. Camilla was in position. She stood in the spot she had been assigned, composed in deep sapphire, her expression carrying that cultivated serenity she had made her public armor. If she knew what was coming, her face gave nothing away, not a tremor, not a shadow, just the steady, practiced presentation of a woman who had learned long ago that the camera was always watching and that composure was the only thing it could not take from her. Catherine stood several feet away, quiet, still, wearing an expression that occupied the exact space between readiness and resolve. She had been briefed. She understood the weight of what she had agreed to, and she had made her decision with the same quiet deliberateness that had defined every significant moment of her public life. She was not here to triumph. She was not here to make a point. She was here because a king had asked her to represent something, and she had said yes. The crown arrived on its ceremonial cushion, carried by a palace official with the careful reverence these objects have always commanded. It entered the room, and the room responded the way it always does, with a subtle collective recognition of something ancient and significant moving through its space. The diamonds caught the chandelier light. The gold carried the weight of centuries. It was, as it had always been, more than an object. Charles reached for it, both hands, unhurried. And the room, without fully understanding why, began to hold its breath. He lifted it from the cushion. He turned, and he walked, not toward Camilla. Every camera in the room tracked him. Every eye followed. And in the space of those few seconds, as the distance between Charles and his wife became unmistakable and then irreversible, the room crossed from ceremony into something it had no existing framework to process. A journalist near the back wall later said that the sound she heard in those seconds was not gasps, not whispers, but something stranger. The sound of an entire room forgetting to breathe. Camilla did not move. To her absolute credit, she did not move. What crossed her face in that moment was not something that can be described without care, because it was not one thing. It was the compressed accumulation of years, of fighting for belonging, of earning a place that the public had not wanted to give her and that she had taken anyway, inch by inch, year by year, through sheer endurance. All of that, in 3 seconds, moving behind her eyes while her face held its careful composure for the cameras that were now pointed entirely at her. Charles stopped before Catherine. She inclined her head. that small, graceful, unhurried inclination that was not performance and not submission but simply the gesture of someone meeting an enormous moment with the stillness it deserved. And then King Charles III placed the crown upon the head of Catherine, Princess of Wales, in front of the world, in front of the cameras, in front of his wife, and in front of history. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then it lasted forever. Catherine did not look at Camilla. Her eyes moved directly to William, who stood to the side with the particular steadiness of a man who has long understood that the crown his wife now wore would one day carry a different name entirely. The look they exchanged needed no translation. It was a conversation completed in less than a second, and it said everything. The future was no longer approaching. It had arrived. In the days that followed, the palace moved with the quiet efficiency of an institution that has survived centuries by knowing how to absorb seismic events without visible fracture. Advisors who had operated within Camilla's network found their schedules rearranged, their proposals unanswered, their access subtly but unmistakably reduced. The draft documents, the sealed correspondence, the carefully constructed frameworks for Laura's unofficial elevation, all of it was filed away in rooms that would not be reopened. Laura herself ceased to appear at palace functions entirely. Not expelled, not named, simply absent, as though the conversation about her had simply concluded. And Camilla remained. That is perhaps the detail that the simplified version of this story always overlooks. Charles did not exile her, did not strip her title, did not reduce her publicly to something lesser than what she had become. She continued to appear at official engagements, continued to fulfill her public duties, continued to present to the world the image of a queen consort moving through her role with composure. But those who watched closely noticed the difference. The gravitational center of the palace had shifted. Quietly, irrevocably. The way tectonic things always shift, not with noise, but with the deep, permanent movement of something that will never return to where it was. Charles stood on his private balcony the morning after the banquet, watching the guards complete their rotation in the courtyard below. The same ritual, the same precision, the same unbroken continuity that had endured through every crisis the monarchy had ever faced. He watched them for a long time, and something in him, some fraction of the weight he had been carrying since that Tuesday morning with the blue folder, seemed to release. He had made the right decision. He had always known that. But knowing something is right and carrying the cost of it are not the same thing. He had made a statement that the world would interpret in 100 different ways. Some would call it decisive. Some would call it cold. Some would frame it as a public act of discipline delivered without mercy to a woman who had loved him through the longest and most complicated years of his life. And all of those interpretations would contain fragments of truth, because the truth of what happened in that banquet hall is not simple enough to fit inside a single framing. Here is what it was at its core. It was a king choosing the institution over the individual, the future over the past, the unbroken promise of service over the tangled, deeply human complications of personal loyalty. It was Charles doing what his entire life had been preparation to do, holding the crown above everything, including himself, including his marriage, including the woman he had waited decades to stand beside. Catherine carries that crown forward now. Not just the physical object, remarkable and heavy and brilliant as it is, but everything it has come to mean after this moment. The history, the complexity, the silent, enormous weight of being the person a king chose when he needed to make the world understand what the monarchy's future would look like. She carries it without drama. That is perhaps the most significant thing about her. And Camilla, the woman who fought longer and harder than almost anyone in modern royal history to earn her place beside a king, now navigates a chapter for which there is no established script. She remains. She endures. She is, as she has always been, more resilient than the public ever fully credits her for being. but the crown is no longer hers. And the message it carried, that message of belonging, of finally and officially and undeniably being here, has moved on without her. Whether the marriage finds its way through this, whether two people bound by decades of complicated, costly, genuine love can absorb this kind of rupture and remain whole, only time will answer that. But one thing is certain. Nothing inside the walls of Buckingham Palace will ever be quite the same again. And here is the question you need to sit with after everything you have just heard. Not the simple question of whether Charles was right or wrong. Those judgments are easy and they miss the point. The real question is this. When duty and love point in opposite directions, and a person can only follow one, what does the choice they make tell you about who they truly are? Charles made his choice in front of the world. Now the world gets to decide what to do with it. If you have followed this story from the beginning and you believe there are people in your life who need to hear it, share this now, because this is not the kind of story that ends here. The ripple from that banquet hall is still moving through the palace, through the family, and through the future of the British monarchy in ways that are only beginning to surface. Stay with this channel, because what is coming next will make everything you just heard feel like the opening chapter. There is a conversation that took place behind closed doors in the 48 hours following the banquet between Catherine and a senior palace figure that has never been reported. A conversation about what wearing that crown actually commits her to. And the details of what was said in that room will change how you understand everything that happened that night. That story is coming. Do not miss it.